When the HOA suddenly banned Nate Carter's beloved backyard smoker, it wasn't just about barbecue, it was an attack on the heart of the community. Behind it all stood Brenda Whitmore, a new HOA president bent on imposing her own vision of order. But Nate had a clever plan and the law on his side. Just wait until you see how this showdown ended and why justice smoked its way to victory. When Nate Carter moved to Willow Springs Estates, he truly believed he'd found a slice of heaven. The small Georgia town had been home to generations of Carters, people who valued family, good food, and simple living. Nate had spent 25 years as a firefighter, battling flames in Atlanta and the surrounding counties. When he finally hung up his helmet, he used his hard-earned savings to buy a modest single-story home with one feature he cared about most: a wide-open backyard. To Nate, that yard wasn't just grass and dirt. It was freedom. It was where he planned to spend his retirement doing what he loved, barbecuing. For years, Nate had built a reputation as a pitmaster. He wasn't boastful about it, but the blue ribbons from county fairs and barbecue competitions spoke for themselves. His prized smoker, a custom-built 500-gallon offset beauty named Big Bertha, was known throughout the region. Folks would drive from the next town over just to sample his brisket or ribs. Most weekends, his yard came alive with the sound of laughter and the aroma of pecan wood smoke. Families brought lawn chairs, kids played in the grass, and Nate worked the pit, apron on and smile wide. It wasn't a business. It was community, neighbors gathering the way they always had. But everything changed the day the new HOA president arrived. Her name was Brenda Whitmore. Recently retired from a long corporate career in Atlanta, Brenda had moved into Willow Springs with big ideas about modernizing the neighborhood. From the moment she arrived, she spoke about bringing order and raising standards. To some, that sounded harmless, but Nate quickly saw the signs: new HOA restrictions, sudden fines for flower beds that didn't match HOA-approved designs, and strongly worded letters about mailbox colors. And then, one crisp spring morning, it was his turn. Nate opened his mailbox and found a thick envelope stamped "Urgent." Frowning, he tore it open right there on the curb. Inside was a notice of noncompliance from the HOA board. The letter was written in cold, legal phrasing. It stated that large outdoor cooking appliances were now prohibited under a newly amended rule, and it explicitly named his smoker, Big Bertha, as a nuisance and a violation of community standards. Nate's eyes widened as he read further. He was ordered to remove the smoker within 7 days. If he failed to comply, he would face daily fines of $250. His hands gripped the letter tighter. For a moment, he stood there on the street, stunned. Big Bertha had never drawn a single complaint, not in the years he'd lived there, not in all the gatherings he'd hosted. A neighbor walking her dog waved to him. Nate managed a faint smile, but inside something churned. He looked again at the HOA letter, reading the words over and over, as if they might somehow change. Nuisance, violation, fines. All because he loved to cook for his friends and neighbors. He glanced back toward his yard. The smoker stood in its usual place, gleaming in the sunlight, harmless, proud, part of his life. But to Brenda, it wasn't community. It wasn't tradition. It was an eyesore, something to be scrubbed away in her picture-perfect vision of the neighborhood. Nate exhaled slowly and muttered under his breath, voice low and disbelieving, "I thought this was America." And with that, a quiet anger began to take root. Nate Carter was never one to back down from a fight, but he always believed in starting with reason. A few days after receiving the compliance notice, he got to work. He spoke with neighbors, friends, and even families from other streets who had long enjoyed his barbecue gatherings. Nearly everyone agreed. This ban was nonsense. So Nate drafted a simple petition. It read, "We, the undersigned residents of Willow Springs Estates, support the continued use of Nate Carter's smoker, Big Bertha, and oppose any HOA restrictions that would prohibit its use." By the following week, over 100 neighbors had signed it. Some added heartfelt comments about what those gatherings had meant to them, how the food and fellowship had brought people together. Armed with that stack of signatures and a binder of local fire and health code compliance documents, Nate walked into the next HOA board meeting. The room was packed. Word had spread quickly through the community, and people showed up in support. Nate stood before the board calmly, his voice measured. "I've always followed the rules. Big Bertha is safely operated and well maintained. These cookouts have been part of this neighborhood for years without a single complaint, until now." He held up the petition. "This is your community speaking. We value tradition. We value neighbors coming together. Please reconsider this action." For a moment, the room was quiet. A few board members looked uneasy, but Brenda sat at the center of the table, arms folded, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned forward, voice cold and deliberate. "We're not running a county fairground here, Mr. Carter. Some of us value peace and cleanliness. Others seem to think their personal hobbies should take priority over community standards." A ripple of disapproval ran through the audience. Nate clenched his jaw but held his ground. When the vote was called, the tally was narrow, 3-2 in favor of upholding the ban. Brenda smiled faintly, satisfied. The next morning, things escalated. Nate spotted an unfamiliar man snapping photos of his backyard from the sidewalk. A badge on the man's jacket read HOA Compliance Inspector. Later that day, another thick envelope landed in his mailbox, this time informing him that fines would begin immediately, backdated to the deadline Brenda had set. By week's end, he would owe $1,000. Word of the vote and the fines spread fast. That afternoon, Nate's neighbor Tom, a retired Marine who had lived next door for years, stopped by. "This is ridiculous," Tom said, shaking his head. "You're the heart of this community, Nate. You've done more to bring people together than anyone. If Brenda wants to fight, she's fighting all of us." Nate appreciated the words, but Brenda wasn't finished. She took her campaign further. Without notifying Nate, she filed a complaint with the county, claiming he was operating an unlicensed commercial cooking operation out of his home. A few days later, a county inspector knocked on Nate's door. The man seemed apologetic. "We got a report about commercial cooking violations," he said, scanning Nate's yard. "Frankly, we haven't had a single complaint except from your HOA president." The inspector found nothing out of order and left shaking his head. But Nate felt something deeper shift inside him. That night, long after the sun had set, he sat alone beside Big Bertha. The black steel barrel gleamed softly under the porch light. He wasn't just at risk of losing a smoker. He was at risk of losing what made this community feel like home. And that was when the anger fully took hold, not just for himself, but for every neighbor tired of arbitrary rules and petty power plays. Staring at the cold steel, Nate's voice was quiet, but resolute. "This ends now." For 2 weeks, Nate Carter barely touched Big Bertha, but it wasn't out of defeat. It was strategy. He poured himself into research, sitting late into the night with HOA bylaws, state property codes, and nonprofit regulations. If Brenda wanted to play legal games, he would meet her on that battlefield, prepared. And that's when he found it. Buried deep in the HOA's covenants was a clause most board members probably never noticed. Private events held without advertised ticket sales or public fees shall be considered personal use of residential property and are not subject to commercial activity restrictions. That was the opening he needed. The next morning, Nate registered a new entity with the state, Nate's Backyard BBQ Club, a nonprofit social club. Membership was free, donations optional. He wasn't selling barbecue. He was creating a space for members to gather and share food as part of a private event. But Nate didn't stop there. He called in favors from his old firehouse buddies. Within a week, they'd poured a sturdy concrete pad under Big Bertha and installed a new canopy for shade and weather protection. Nate also had a licensed contractor upgrade his ventilation system to meet and exceed commercial safety standards, far beyond what the HOA required for residential properties. By now, word of his plan had begun to spread. Neighbors were buzzing. People stopped Nate at the grocery store to ask how they could join the club. Then came Nate's master stroke. He reached out to a well-respected regional food critic who'd once awarded his brisket the top prize at the county fair. The critic agreed to attend the opening night of the new club and bring a photographer. That Friday evening, Nate's yard transformed. Rows of folding chairs and picnic tables filled the space. Neighbors arrived in droves, veterans, firefighters, teachers, and young families. A few local officials quietly joined as well. Everyone understood the rules. No sales, no tickets, just donations and private membership. The aroma of slow-smoked brisket and ribs filled the air. Laughter and conversation buzzed under the canopy as Nate worked the pit, towel slung over one shoulder. The food critic stayed for hours, sampling every dish, taking notes. He left impressed. 2 days later, the newspaper hit doorsteps across the county with a bold headline: Hidden Gem, Nate Carter's backyard smoker might serve the best BBQ in the county. Social media caught fire. A popular local food blogger posted a video of the event. This HOA tried to ban barbecue. Now the whole town is rallying behind Nate. The TikTok went viral. Overnight, Nate's club received hundreds of membership requests from across the county, but not everyone was smiling. That weekend, as Nate prepared for another member gathering, Brenda arrived. She marched up the driveway, flanked by 2 board members, clutching a freshly printed cease and desist letter. Nate didn't flinch. Waiting beside him was his new ally, a seasoned HOA attorney working pro bono after hearing Nate's story. As Brenda launched into a tirade about code violations and improper use of property, the lawyer calmly stepped forward. "This is a private, nonprofit club on Mr. Carter's personal property," he said evenly. "You are now in violation of state law by attempting to interfere. I strongly advise you to withdraw this action before further legal consequences follow." Brenda's face flushed deep red. Cameras from local news outlets, invited by Nate's supporters, captured every second of her retreat. The tide had turned. Within a month, Nate's Backyard BBQ Club had become the talk of the entire county. What had started as a quiet act of defiance was now a full-blown community phenomenon. Each week, Nate's yard transformed into a lively gathering spot. Long picnic tables, string lights, and the ever-present scent of pecan wood smoke drew members from every corner of the region. Membership soared. The club's roster now included local teachers, first responders, military veterans, small business owners, even a few county officials who had once visited Nate's gatherings as curious supporters and now came as loyal members. That summer, Nate entered his signature brisket in the county's prestigious annual food festival. It was a bold move given the recent headlines, but Nate had nothing to lose. The result? First place, best BBQ in the county. Local television crews covered the victory, calling Nate's story a symbol of community resilience and tradition triumphing over bureaucracy. Interviews poured in. Nate gave credit to his neighbors and supporters, always humbly reminding everyone that it wasn't about him. It was about keeping the spirit of the neighborhood alive. Meanwhile, the HOA made one last attempt to push back. Brenda and her allies tried to levy additional fines, arguing that Nate's growing club was changing the character of the neighborhood. But this time, Nate was ready. With the full backing of his attorney, and now a very public platform, Nate filed a countersuit for harassment and damages. The legal claim was solid. The HOA had not only overstepped its own covenants, but had subjected Nate to targeted and unlawful scrutiny. Faced with mounting legal costs, public backlash, and a growing wave of residents siding with Nate, the HOA board quickly folded. They settled out of court. All previous fines were rescinded. The HOA paid Nate's legal fees in full. And most importantly, a formal apology was entered into the public record. But the story didn't end there. Brenda, now the focus of local ridicule and isolated within the community, resigned from the HOA board under pressure. The vacancy was filled by Mark Dalton, a longtime neighbor and club member who had attended Nate's first cookout years ago. One of Mark's first actions? A formal revision to the HOA's rules. Traditional cooking practices and the use of safe outdoor smokers shall be protected as a valued part of the neighborhood's culture. The message was clear. That summer, as twilight fell across Willow Springs, Nate stood beside Big Bertha, flipping racks of ribs for a crowd of nearly 200 members. Children laughed nearby, old friends swapped stories, and music played softly under the string lights. A local reporter approached, microphone in hand. Mr. Carter, did you ever imagine all this would come from one letter in your mailbox?" Nate chuckled, wiping his hands on his apron. "Funny thing," he said, eyes twinkling. "All they had to do was leave me alone. Now we're the #1 grill in the county, right here in my backyard." The reporter smiled. Cameras panned across the joyful crowd. And so the story of Nate's Backyard BBQ Club became legend. A tale of how one man, with courage, community, and a bit of barbecue smoke, stood up to overreach and came out stronger than ever. For every bite of smoky brisket served under those backyard stars, one truth remained. Some fires, once lit, can't be put out.